the Cyber Explorer report, which is the topic of today's conversation. Just want to check that my screen is sharing. I'm having a small technical problem. Forgive me.
Not right now, exactly.
That's a little bit odd. Let's try that again. Oh, that's very strange. Hang on a sec, folks. I'm sorry. I'm just going to see if I can get this sorted out. We all got a brand new version of the webinar platform, and so we're all feeling a little confused.
I think it's also good people are joining still as we speak, so just take your time and they have enough time to join.
Okay. It's rather odd though. I'm just going to leave and rejoin in a sec. There you go. I'm back. I wonder if the studio can make me a presenter again.
Hold
Or an
on.
organizer.
Try again. Try now.
Can you see my
I
sharing now?
I can't. Can everyone? What about the other speakers?
No, unfortunately not.
Karen,
No, unfortunately not.
It's all very exciting. Yeah, let's try again.
shall I try and share them from the studio?
Yes, Maddie, that would be nice.
Yeah, perhaps Medina, I'm sorry.
Not at all. Let me see. Are you able to see my screen?
That's
Yeah.
right. Okay, there we are. That was exciting. Nothing like the technical failure to get the blood boiling. So, welcome again, everyone. Sorry for that glitch. As I said, it's a new version of the platform, and we're all getting a bit used to it. And being an old dog, I find it very hard to learn new tricks. So my name is Charles. I'm the head for security research. We're here today to discuss our cyber extortion report called the Cy Explorer. It's the second time we've brought it out. Studio, we can go to the next slide. If you haven't had a chance yet to view it, there is the download link. You can use the QR code and scan it with your phone or go straight to the URL. And I'm sure somebody can share the URL link in the chat for us also. So the Cyber Explorer is a mammoth effort, in which we try and capture and share everything that we know about the problem of cyber extortion. And that's a multidisciplinary effort. So my team kind of takes the lead in terms of analyzing the data, but we also have various experts from our CERT, that's our Computer Emergency Response team, and from our CCERT, and from our analyst teams who help guide us through some of the more technical elements. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll take a moment to introduce everyone. First with me today is Diana Paulsen. She's a researcher on my team based out of Sweden, and has been tracking this issue for about 4 years now. Hi, Diana. Thank you for joining us. Diana puts enormous blood, sweat, and tears into this report every year, so I think it's a real privilege for us to have a chat with her. I've already introduced myself. Also, the dashingly handsome young man from France is Robinson Delaguerre. He heads up our computer security incident response team in France, and has a lot of really, I think, valuable hands-on experience encountering these threat actors in the wild, so to speak. And then finally, it's always a pleasure to welcome Simona Kraus, based in Germany and attached to our CyberSOC there. Simona is a threat hunter and threat analyst, and she'll also be able to bring some first-hand experience to the discussion. So let's jump in. Can I just check? There's somebody has very beautiful bird sounds in the background, and they're making me want to go to sleep. So perhaps if you're not talking, we can mute. Thank you. I think it might be on the studio side. Let's go to the next slide and have a first look at the data. So the Cyber Explorer is based on or centered on a very unique data set that we have been collecting now since 2020. And you see the volumes of victims reported there as the blue lines. The little orange lines that you see at the bottom are the number of unique threat actors that we track. Now that's a much smaller number for obvious reasons, but you can see that that orange number has also grown. I'll let Diana comment on that in a moment. But it's important to understand what we're looking at here. And we very deliberately use the term cyber extortion and not the term ransomware, because what we're able to observe is pronouncements or threats that are made by threat actors on their dedicated leak sites, typically somewhere on the dark web. So since 2020, we've been trying to track these threat actors, track their leak sites, and from the leak sites collect the volumes of victims that are published there. And as I'm sure today's discussion will make very clear, that's an invaluable research. It's probably unprecedented in the history of crime that we get a blow-by-blow update directly from the criminals. But it's also confusing and frustrating because there's a lot in this data that we don't see. We don't see victims that pay the ransom but don't get listed on the leak sites. We don't see who the attackers try and compromise but fail. We only see who they successfully compromise, attempt to extort, and then ultimately publish on their leak sites. So invaluable data, but certainly not the whole picture. If we forward the slides, you'll notice that one of the really extraordinary and somewhat disheartening things about this year's data is that it's increased again. It's increased 77% from the last 12-month period. We can flick ahead in the slides there. And that's off this dip that we saw in 2022, which we at the time attributed to the disruptive effects of the invasion of Ukraine. Many of these actors, of course, at least the what they call the operators, what we call the operators, the core of these operations that are used, that publish these leaks, they are located in the former CIS countries, so countries, Russia and the surrounds. And of course, they were very disrupted during the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. And so we saw a dip there, but as soon as things stabilized, the crime has returned with a vengeance. And we are now seeing record high numbers every year. So Diana, I want to, if we can go to the next slide, I wanted to start by asking you about the location of these victims. Of course, we've already spoken about the limitations of the data. There's a lot that we can't perceive from it. But one of the things you do at great personal expense every month is to research exactly where these victims are, or they are headquartered at least. So tell us a little bit about the picture that emerges when we look at that. And Studio, we can go to the next slide.
Yes, all right. Thank you, Shah. Can everyone hear me? Just checking in.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, so as you say, we spend a lot of time to really understand the victimology of that crime, of cyber extortion. And, it's, of course, we find patterns, but we have to say that, it is a global threat. We see, 75% of all countries in the world, since we are tracking it since 2020, has been a victim at least once. So 75% of all, of all world countries has been impacted by cyber extortion. But of course, we can see a little bit what is the trend from the past 12 months. And this is what, our annual ransomware cyber extortion report is about. We're actually looking at the wrong slide. This is industry. So if we could go to the world map, for example, or to the region. If you keep in mind the timeline that we've just seen before, we actually see the 77% increase, but we also see a dip before, and that is actually 2022, the year where we thought we saw a difference of a decrease of English-speaking countries. Now, looking at the past 12 months, we've actually seen a huge increase, a significant increase in English-speaking countries. For example, the US has been, grown by 108%. We also see often Canada and UK. So we call those the big three. So the big three English-speaking countries. And because they're taking so much presence and so much space of a world view like this that you see on the screen, we actually removed them to see, do other regions actually stick out. And here we see Europe. Europe has been, in our analysis, the second biggest region impacted. And especially Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Netherlands, Switzerland, for example, has been impacted the most. But we also see Latin America. So we see Brazil here impacted a lot. We see Australia, we see India. But in growth and difference in regional shift, we see, for example, Africa, which was a surprising finding. So we saw Africa as a whole an increase of 100%, and South Africa mostly present there. Or we see the Nordics increase by 78%, for example.
And of course, Diana, we had that awful incident that's kind of ongoing in South Africa now, isn't it? That we were talking about this week with the national labs that were ransomed and now can't process the blood tests. I'm interested, if I may, just to ask you a little bit more about these regional shifts. So in the past, I've argued that we were seeing and would see a shift away from the big English-speaking economies towards the bigger non-English-speaking economies. And I think the argument I made was that there's this language and cultural barrier that not prevents, but perhaps adds a level of cost to actors who want to exploit or extort victims in non-English speaking locales, right? Because this is not a crime of hacking per se, it's a crime of extortion, which means perceiving, understanding what the business does and how they do it, and being able to find their vulnerable vulnerable
Exactly.
spots.
You need to understand what you have in front of you to really see what leverage do I have, to use that data now as a hostage to extort money from businesses.
Exactly. So I've got a question for you here, Robinson. If we're seeing growth now in, for example, Europe, that suggests that the threat actors are becoming comfortable with dealing with victims in French and German, Italian, Spanish. I think if we're seeing the numbers in South America again, would be Spanish, Portuguese. Does that suggest that elements of this ecosystem are now local in those regions and not just based in the CIS countries?
So, local in the region, I would say common sense suggests that it's not. However, that those those cyber criminal groups have professionalized themselves enough so that they have looked for people specifically to quote unquote break the European market, as a company would do with external growth. Very definitely. Anecdotally, we have seen in one case, one ransomware operator at some point trying to figure out if the machine he was on had outgoing internet connectivity. And to do so, they entered from memory and not from a Google search, an address that basically is an obscure web bandwidth testing site that was very popular in the French internet in the early 2000s. Therefore, anecdotally, we suppose that this particular guy is like my age plus or minus 5 years and was in the French internet at the time. That they are in France currently is very unlikely. They are probably in a country where it's way more difficult to be arrested for cyber crimes committed or victimizing French companies. That is why you have a big 3 on that map. But yeah, it is to me a sign of the times that those threat groups are now looking to adapt their approach to more international victims.
I want to ask you a similar question, Simon. But before I do, I'm reminded now of a very important logistical point, which I didn't make, is that we will be opening the floor to questions in the second half of this session, and we will make as much time for questions as we possibly can. So I'm going to focus on our panelists now for the next 10 minutes or so, and then I will be opening the floor. So please, if you have questions, pop them into the questions panel. We're going to try and get to as many of them as we can. So Simona, I just wanted to ask you, also based in Germany, and obviously there's Germany, I think of the countries outside of the US, Canada, and Great Britain is the most impacted country from this perspective. What's been your experience there? Are you seeing it? Are people talking about it? How do they explain it?
Yeah, thanks, Joel. Great question. And hi, everybody. I've got several hypotheses, and I was talking also to our customers. With the Gen AI regarding the language, it's much more easier to translate and to adopt it to maybe also in the German environment. But we're also a speaking language country, and there are various hypotheses that I have currently why we are so frequently attacked. Firstly, the fact that the countermeasures in the US have taken effect. We see that, and that maybe this become less successful for the threat actors. Although we see an increase, so that they try more to attack other countries like Germany. And then we see, of course, the geopolitical reason, for example, Russia, that the ransomware groups are more and more attacking us also from the hacktivist side. And hacktivism is also a great point regarding the Israeli and Iranian conflict, and that companies are attacked that maybe provide Israeli software products. So there are several reasons why there could be the increase. And of course, we are a rich country and an easy victim for them.
There's lots of businesses. All right, we could talk about this for long, but I think the bottom line right now is that we're actually seeing two factors. The first is what we predicted, which is that the crime is seeping out beyond those three traditionally common demographics, and we're seeing more and more diverse countries being impacted at a higher and higher rate. But simultaneously, we are still seeing incredible growth in the US, Canada, and Great Britain. But perhaps we can go to the next slide, because there's another element, Diana, that we surface in the report, which I know makes Robinson's blood run very hot, which is when we examine the size of the victims. And what we've been saying in social media, and which I find is horrific to observe, is that so many of the victims are small businesses. But of course, small is a relative term, right? And caveat supply, this is what we observe, rather than necessarily what's happening. But tell us, at least as a start, what the data says about the size of the victims as businesses.
Exactly. So I think it's really important to start with definition. What are small organizations in our definition, because there is no central definition for all organizations of the world, basically, or classification. So we understand small businesses, anything under 1,000 employee count. And as you say, I mean, we spend a lot of time with the victims itself to classify and add data points, and then we find, of course, a lot of small organizations being impacted the most. So I mean, it's literally our finding that we see organizations under 1,000 employees 4.2 times more impacted. But what we're also trying in the report is to put that into perspective. Again, we spoke already about language and economy. So what does it actually mean in comparison to how many businesses are out there in each group, in each business size? And we do an exploration to say, okay, if there is not a central database out there that we can compare to or correlate it to, what is out there. And we found that the North American industry classification called NICE 2022, they have something where they actually register, businesses registered in North America and the US, and we find that, over 90%, I think 98% of all businesses are actually under 1,000. So then we can argue and reason, okay, then it's most likely because there are so many small businesses out there that we see, the direct result of that they are becoming a victim. So we don't necessarily argue, it's targeting small businesses, but it is impacting small businesses more because it's just more small businesses out there.
Or, of course, as I think Robinson would argue, what we're seeing is the businesses that are apparently refusing to pay and are therefore being shamed on the leak sites. So another possible explanation is simply that small businesses are less willing or able to pay. But I think, my sense is if you look at the sheer concentration of registered businesses that would be classified as small, that seems to be the most prominent and obvious predictor of what kind of business is going to be a victim.
I think that's
That
such an
correlation
interesting
seems
point, not to keep that in mind. I mean, the victims that we're observing from the dark web leak sites are the ones that have not complied to something, to the ransom demands or whatever the demands were really, and that's why they end up. And then again, if you turn that around, then the likelihood for small businesses under 1,000 to turn up there is absolutely present now, as given.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to reiterate, I think what this correlation between the volumes of victims and the shape of economies or economic demographics suggests, certainly to me, and I know others may not agree with me on this, but is that the crime is highly opportunistic in nature. In other words, that the criminals are compromising whoever they can, and then seeking to extort the ransom after that's happened. And that means, and I really feel strongly that this is supported in the data. That means that really anyone who has something that can be taken from them is a potential victim. And that's no solace to businesses, and it's no solace to the business that was a victim. But I think it's a lesson to the rest of us, and it's especially a lesson to countries, regions, industries that perhaps haven't been affected so much, to remind them that, look at this, you're not exempt on any technical basis. But if we can go to the next slide, speaking of exemption, the other thing that emerges in this report, Diana, which I think is really interesting, is the prominence of victims in the healthcare sector. And for the first time this year, healthcare as an industry features in the top 3 most impacted industries. It's always been manufacturing. It's always been professional services. Those have always been up there. But we actually haven't seen healthcare impacted to this extent. If I recall, it was 160% increase in victims from
It's
that
top 3
sector.
in the
What's
past
going
12
on
months.
there? Top 3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
What's going on in the healthcare sector?
Yeah, that's good. Good question. I think until now we've seen, as we call it, some anti-targeting or almost anti-impacting, because the ecosystem is so flexible, and there's so many different players within cyber extortion that what you see on the screen now has been those are rules that we've seen like 2 years ago. We've observed that with Babuk, and then also DarkSide, the dark screenshot here, where they don't want to impact these sectors, and that would be hospitals or healthcare, it would be nonprofit, it would be education, schools, and then even small businesses and government sector. But of course, during that time, 2 years ago and older, they slipped, and they weren't in control of who they accidentally impacted, because of the nature of having affiliates amplifying their attack surface. You are not always in control. And I've seen a question also that goes a little bit with that as well, about regions. Why aren't we seeing certain regions more present than others? Because we have seen for a very long time this anti-targeting as well, where we see exclusive, excluding regions by language and keyboard, in the actual code, in the malicious code, but also again the rules of regions that threat actors don't want to impact. And actually, we are observing, and that we've written in this report as well, we are observing an expansion of that, where we actually see other regions explicitly mentioned not to be impacted. And healthcare has somehow disappeared from that rule, from that moral or principle as they used to have 2 years ago. And that, yeah, exactly. And that results into, that of the 4,374 victim businesses that we have been tracking and documenting, we actually see top 3 healthcare. And, we've seen, I've looked a little bit into more concrete examples, but again, it's like the rest of the victimology. There is no pattern. There is no one single threat actor impacting healthcare. There is no one single region that is impacted by that. It's everywhere. And I think you've just mentioned briefly South Africa, for example, who just now at the end of June actually experienced a ransomware attack, which was claimed now only on Friday by Black Suit. And impacting, impacting like ongoing testing results in an ongoing health crisis in South Africa. We've seen NHS, we've seen Children's Hospital in Chicago, we've seen Sophia Hammed here in the Nordics in Sweden, and those are just a handful of examples that actually shows it seems to be the norm. It seems to be a threshold that isn't there anymore with healthcare, unfortunately.
So it's almost as if there were these like soft barriers. There was a soft barrier of language and culture. There was a soft barrier of healthcare and other, if you like, industries that are critical to societal well-being. And maybe there was this sort of soft barrier of anti-targeting where actors stayed away from certain regions because they feared the economic backlash. And those barriers all appear to be collapsing. Do we have a sense, is that because there's new players in the market? Is that because it's harder and harder to find victims? What is behind that?
Very good question. I'm going to leave that question open to anyone here in this panel because it's a tricky one. I mean, we don't know. We can't really know. But I think a theory that we have, Charles, is, is there a shift in individuals engaging in that form of crime? And, could age play a role, like not having those thresholds or those old rules to not harm individuals, to not harm elderly and so on. As we have actually seen in Barbuk before, they've attacked accidentally an elderly home like 2 or 3 years ago, and they apologized and helped them with penetration testing and recommendations and said, we value the elderly in our society. And that doesn't seem to be the case anymore because the impact is not actually only, patient data like Chicago, the Chicago example is the Children's Hospital. We've just seen the news coverage now that happened in January, and now they know that 800,000 patient records have been leaked or sold or something. But it's also actually impacting care, care of human beings, and that is very problematic.
Robinson, Simone, do you guys have a sense? Do you sense that there's a shift in the tone of the threat actor? Is it? I see Peter van der Walt, who has a very good name, is asking. Is this a cyber warfare thing? Is it politically motivated? Any thoughts?
It's also psychologically, I think. It's a neutralization of crime. It's the honest pen tester helping, but we all know, no, they're not helping. They try to turn the psychology. It's a neutralization of, oh, it's not that bad, or the that they are young and try to find explanation for themselves why it's legitimate to do it. So it's a lack of understanding what is good and what is evil. And also the monetary reason, we see it also increasing with the hacktivism, that they need the money and that there is a need for money, and the best money you can get is with the data. So they are also attacking more and more education. We also see there an increase, and this legitimization for them, this neutralization of crime.
So as once you make the decision to engage in crime, you justify it to yourself using these neutralization techniques. You justify it to others. You become dependent on the money or addicted to the money in some way, and so that neutralization bubble just keeps expanding. You can, make more and more excuses to yourself for worse and worse crimes.
Or like
Robinson,
Diana says, the young people that are not having the understanding of what is right and wrong, that they're young and wild, and then they do things that neutralize their crime.
Robinson, any sense on your side that the landscape is changing?
I was going to point out something, is that the three trends you're describing are of a slightly different nature. Like, we see on one hand what is definitely the professionalization of cybercrime, with like expanding geographically, tailoring to the market of your victim. And then you see something that probably stemmed more from like a failure to control such a nebulous structure as a cybercrime structure. And that led to targeting creep, basically. It's really hard. And we know that because of the way cryptography is implemented in most of the major brands of ransomware, so that the leaders of the network have a way to produce a decryptor, even if the person doing the encryption is not willing to. That has been built from the beginning into most ransomwares, or at least most organized ones, as a fail-safe, so that the top of the pyramid of the criminal group has some control. But effectively, because it's all criminals talking to each other over talks and whatnot, someone going rogue is going to go rogue. So at the end of the day, those like ethics in targeting becomes really hard to enforce. So why keep them?
Interesting, yeah. While I've got you, Robinson, there's a question from Andrew Williams, which you were very confident about answering, about the size of the ransom payments. Is that a factor here? Are the ransom payments getting smaller and therefore kind of forcing people to forcing these actors to take more victims?
So the reason I was very confident to answering that question is because like we don't know. There is like in many ways, it's getting harder and harder to know what the amount of the ransom is without engaging with the threat agents, and mostly our clients do not engage with those threat agents. However, and it's not Andrew's question, it's a similar questions by Bernard Grover about, do we see an increase in double extortion? This is what our data set is about. Our data set is about that double extortion, in the sense that structurally, the ransomware that is just encryption and has no leak site, no organized, like no public place on the internet or on Tor, we have very little visibility about. And this is the one that is probably the most common because it's just easier to set up. And this is the one that also probably doesn't touch clients of ours, because structurally it is more targeted to smaller companies and obviously to individuals.
I'm going to, thanks Robinson, I'm going to just summarize some answers very briefly to some of the questions about this last section, and then Diana, I want to come back to you because I think there's a lot of questions on a similar theme. So the first one is from Leroy. Leroy asks, are there particular technological weaknesses or strengths in South Africa's digital landscape? Leroy, complicated question. I think what we know is there is a correlation between vulnerability and victimness. So a business that cannot maintain a robust cyber hygiene is more likely to form victim. And so if your belief is that South African businesses are in that place, then we would anticipate that there will be more victims in South Africa. The other attribute of South Africa is that although numbers have been growing very rapidly in the last year, they're actually relatively low. So South Africa still does, I think, have an opportunity to clarify its position on things like whether ransoms could or should be paid, what is excluded from cyber extortion, whether there's mandatory reporting, etc. And I think those things also have a marked impact on the shape of the victimology that we see. Then the other question was about size. I think it was from you, Andrew. Are smaller businesses easier targets since they don't have resources? I think there's an argument to be made for that. It would seem apparent that smaller businesses are, less equipped to defend themselves. But I also think that attack surface plays a big. Yeah, go ahead, Robinson.
Yeah, but on the other hand, if you're so small, you have nothing to be targeted. Yes, it's a lot of, like, if we're supposing there's a ratio of 1 to 100 between large and small businesses, I guess the reason we are only seeing a ratio of 4 is one, that we discount all the ransomware without a leak site, and the other is most small businesses don't even have IT.
Yeah.
Like, at all.
Yeah, exactly. So there's many factors there, I think, that come into play. I'm not sure if I'm saying this name correctly, but Jeroboam asks about the world map excluding the big three, and then points to those countries that are not featuring, and how do we explain that? I think our answer to that would be firstly the anti-targeting that Diana spoke about. So there's a very clear rule. I won't even say unspoken rule. There's a very clear rule that a lot of these operators do not attack the former CIS countries: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. The stands, everyone around them are avoided. And increasingly, that anti-targeting is extending to include Iran and China. So that's answer number one. Answer number two is, as we've said, countries where there's very acute language and cultural barriers, like Japan and China, I think are underrepresented because it's just really hard work for a threat actor to find their way around those victims. And then the rest, I think, are just too small from a digital economy point of view, and that's why we don't see them being impacted. Cool. So I think, Diana, we were talking about this anti-targeting, and we were talking about this collapse of the moral barrier, and that brings us very nicely, I think, if we can go to the next slide in the studio, to this dynamic, this phenomenon of re-victimization, where someone gets compromised, extorted, I imagine, refuses to pay the ransom, and so gets listed on a leak site. And then at some later point, we see them listed again, either on the same leak site or on a different leak site. Tell us a bit about your findings, because that's something we've never really explored before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty unique. We've noticed that before, just like in individual occasions, that we do actually recognize victims that have been posted on the dark web before. So we wanted to investigate a little bit into the phenomenon of re-victimization. Like, is that actually a thing? And if so, what do we find, and what patterns could we see? So we pulled the whole victim data set of 11,244 victims that we know of, and we checked whether or not we find victims reoccurring, and we did. So we found in over 200 cases we found a reoccurrence of either 2 times or even 3 times, where a victim organization ended up 3 times on actually on 3 different leak sites in connection to 3 different brands. And we have a few theories around that, why that is. But I also want to take a minute to just explain that, it almost doesn't matter whether or not this is an actual, real second cyber attack, once again, because from the victim experience, this is a re-victimization nevertheless. Because from a victim experience, you need to now make sure or be capable of checking whether or not you are actually experience a second wave or a second cyber attack, and need to be, able to work through that crisis once again. You are exposed to reputational damage again, now in connection to another ransomware brand. This is so transparent to the public that it will be picked up by researchers, by journalists, and by the media. Therefore, we find, this actually quite serious, the phenomena of re-victimization. And then we found, so the unexpected finding we found is that we actually found re-victimization more than 2 times, so actually 3 times. And then we found that, re-victimization can happen between 0 days and 1,301 days maximum. So between 0 days and 3.5 years, we found victims being reposted on the dark web with different, under the same or most often under a different ransomware brand. So we then wanted to check, can we find a pattern or like a relationship of correlations between different leak sites, between different threat actors, so that we would maybe find a pattern. Okay, this brand is always reposting from that brand, and so on. And this is what we're seeing here. So kind of a cluster analysis where the size of each node represents engagement in re-victimization. And then it can differ, like it goes into direction, and we've tried to mark this in arrows, whether or not that threat actor group is reposting from someone else or is being reposted from. So we have different color coding, and I think we explained this quite extensively in the report. So if you're interested in that, I really I recommend to read that chapter. In short, we did not find a specific relationship or pattern, because it's just all over the place, and that in itself is a really interesting finding, that everyone seems to be doing that to one degree in one way or the other. And we are actually taking some of the clusters out and analyzing them in the report. I think we had an example of that maybe in the next slide, where we, for example, we can see that Lockbit is actually one of the biggest engager in re-victimization. And then we can see if they are actually reposting from others or being reposted from. So the arrows that are going to Lockbit is that they're reposting from other sites, for example. They're reposting themselves within 2 to 3 months or longer. So it's a really messy space, and we actually found that this is happening mostly since 2023. So again, it really feels like in the whole report, it's reoccurring that it feels something has changed over time, because of course we are observing re-victimization since 2020, but the majority only since 2023. And then the time frame of the report is until Q1 now, 2024. We see already a very similar volume of that. So we expect this to continue. The second aspect of re-victimization is then, can we actually find out how much time in between? We have a slide for that as well. That here we can be fairly certain of the first timestamp of occurrence and this the time delay then until we find them a second time. Could we look for that slide of the time delays showing a block? So we we conclude that we can think of 3 reasons why this is happening. The first reason is most likely an affiliate crossover, as it's called in the industry. So that means that the affiliate is just reposting it to another brand, working with another ransomware operator, trying again to get paid, but also to increase the pressure, or in worst case scenario, actually to just punish that business who has not complied or shown any willingness to comply to the ransom demand. So that's the first one that we think is highly likely. The second one is that we actually do see an actual second cyber attack. So we think when we see a lot of time in between the first and the second victimization, we think the likelihood that business or organization has experienced a second wave is likely. So where we have 2 years in between, 3 years in between, 3.5 years in between, we think that's highly likely, and we also see that the likelihood of several different threat actors being involved, the more time has passed. And then the third one is, data travels, especially for the organizations that we're observing here that have not complied, that have lost, everything and have paid the consequences of their data being stolen, sold, leaked. Could be potentially someone else just trying to extort again based on the stolen or traveled data. We're unable to show the slide right now, it seems, but I think the conclusion of that time delay, one more, this is an example of Akira, who's been only involved in second poster, what we're seeing here on the screen. But concluding the time delay, we see 0 until 1,301 days in between. We find that 50% of re-victims or businesses re-victimized is between 80 and 302 days, and we find the median in between or at 177 days. So that translates into 6 months. So I think exactly that's the slide I've been just
finally
talking about. So you see again, the blue box is 50%. So the probability between 80 and 302 days is given there. The median is 177 days when they reoccur on the dark web once more. But we also have those outliners to the right, and that goes up to 1,301 days. So it's been a really interesting investigation, and for us just showing how persistent that threat unfortunately is. And from my perspective, experience that a second time must be a very horrific victim experience, and in terms of the harm that they're experiencing once again.
Diana, thanks. There are a lot of questions about that, and I want to try and come back to them. But I also want to skip ahead one slide because there's a question from, is it Dan? No, Johan. Guerick. Question from Guerick about, I think, what we would call the hidden number. In the studio, if we could go to the next slide, please. Guerick asks, and forgive me for the pronunciation. He asks whether these numbers are just the tip of the iceberg, and would you say those figures percentage-wise are 10, 20% of them higher? We actually have some insight into that now for the first time in this report. Why don't you share with us what we know about the so-called dark number, which is the number of victims that are extorted but never actually appear on the leak sites?
Yeah, exactly. So in criminology, we call this the dark number. So the part of what we don't know that we're quite clearly here transparent about. Of course, this is a recurring question, has always been a recurring question, like what is the actual, number of victims? And because we've seen much more activity in the law enforcement space, they've done, a great job in attempting to disrupt cyber extortion and those actors in the past 12 months, but even before that, we do have insights into that now. So in the past 12 months, we've seen at least 3 big CyX operations being attempted to disrupt. And I say attempted because Lockbit at this point is still online, even though extremely little activity right now since June. Black Cat did an exit scam after the attempt of disruption, and Ragnarloka has been disrupted successfully. In all 3 occasions, we receive information from law enforcement, which is great, especially with Lockbit. It was great to observe how they handled this and shared info sheets on the reality of Lockbit's victimology. So here we actually found that even though, you can see on the screen in victim count, those are very different operations, posting very different volumes of victims, we actually see a very similar range of 50 to 60% of victims that we didn't know about, that we didn't document. But now, after law enforcement shared their information, we could calculate that.
Studio, I think we can go to the next slide. There's a nice visualization of the impact of that there, showing what we think if we apply that 50 to 60% escalation of what the numbers are likely to look like.
So I think, one part, it's, the organizations that have paid and that have never showed up. I think there's also maybe a small amount of organizations, businesses that were never meant to be compromised, but accidentally did, because it's an opportunistic form of crime, and they also never ended up on the leak sites. But it shows quite nicely also visually here, like it's, it's out of our range of what we've been documenting, and just jumping out of this chart completely.
I've got some questions here about technical defenses, and then there's a lot more questions about re-victimization, Diana. But maybe
I can answer them.
Okay, thank you. That'll be great. Maybe I can throw these technical questions at you, Robinson, and at you, Simone. Just to the people who have joined us on the webinar. We're approaching the end of our time. What I'm going to do is ask my panelists if they could stay until we've answered the questions. We always seem to run out of time for these things. So I'm going to ask them to stand, and we're going to keep trying to answer your questions. But if you do have to drop off, if you've joined us today and you do have to drop off, just to say thank you again for joining us. Thank you for your time. Please feel free to reach out if you have more questions and you can't get them answered here. If you can stay with us a bit longer, please do. We'll try and answer as many questions as we can. But if you have to drop off, thank you so much. Thanks for being here today, and we hope to see you at our next webinar again. So having said that, there's 2 technical questions. The one from Andrew Williams, I think, is quite general. How successful are we at stopping these attackers? What's your sense there? And I guess I would extend that by saying, how do we become more successful? And then there's a more specific question about something called the Cato network, CATO, which is not something I'm familiar with. Is that a term that either of you understand?
Not on my side, no.
No.
Okay,
but
nothing on Cato.
I'm going to jump on a question that you didn't mention, because the answer is quick. Are extortion attempts always based on real compromise, or is there also a degree of smoke and mirrors and of basically liars? The answer is yes. People lie on the internet, and cyber extortion operators are also lying. Either coming from, obviously what almost all of us have seen is them failing to mention or jumping to the group instead of naming exactly what part of an organization they compromised, which is fair game. Whatever field office of a company is still part of the company. But we have also seen, for instance, last year, there was a group of victims that just received an email saying that it was the threat agent group Lockbit and if they didn't send money to a Bitcoin wallet, they would get DDoSed. Similarly, we get some extortion attempt based on like theft of employee data that is just based on publicly breached data about employees of a company. So yes, it happens all the time. Not the ones we are talking about though.
Are being extorted. But as you say, Robinson, I think it's one of the reasons we like extortion and not ransomware, because that's really the heart of this. And Diana's research around the re-victimization, I think, illustrates it again. You can become a victim a second time, actually, regardless of whether you've been compromised the second time or not. Once your data, once the knowledge of your compromise is out there.
And I would like to go
Robinson,
back to the question maybe regarding the technical recommendation that we maybe can
yes,
give, or the
please.
question. That would be awesome. So
Yeah,
if I could start, Robinson, and maybe then you can say your additionally your information. So we give recommendation technically and individually, and from the threat informed defense perspective, we really try to understand the real world behavior of such threat actors. And when when our customers were attacked, and we likely know that there will be a re-victimization, we check their whole infrastructure regarding their vulnerabilities, the latest IOCs, maybe also the IOCs that we have seen, the tooling that the threat actors are using. And if they're not using such tools, we try to block everything that we can to understand the most realistic way how they would attack, how they attacked. So the holistic view, do the threat modeling, and then we start threat hunting to check, okay, how is now the infrastructure, the security posture, and step by step we give recommendation for our customers, and this is very individual. So this is a way how you effectively can try to set choke points to say, okay, we try to prevent the re-victimization, or at least if they tried or affiliates to attack us a second time, that we've got choke points, and that my data or our data is not exfiltrated by our clone Omega. Okay, then we track, detect, or block it, and we set choke points automatically and try to automate it to make it more visible and transparent.
Robinson, anything else from your perspective in terms of defenses?
So yeah, to get back to the question of like, do we have figures on how effective we are at stopping those criminal groups? Well, technically those figures would be posted by law enforcement, and those are the arrests. Outside of that, we stop attacks. We don't stop the groups, sadly. And we also know this is the nature of the threat. Those threat actor groups dissolve and reform, basically changing identities but not changing perpetrators. And this is not up to us, sadly, but also thankfully. This would be the matter of like very coordinated police operations that we are seeing more and more. Like they have done very good work in the last year, like stripping down botnets and cyber criminal networks. So we are doing better. Is it probably just a drop in the ocean? Yes, but I mean, we have to start somewhere.
So I just want to reiterate for several of the questions, for example, from Guerick says, have we quantified the amount of companies that try to play? Andrew asks, do we have numbers on how successful we are at stopping this? And I think Emily asks, why do they have these extortion sites to begin with? So I think there's one answer to all of those questions, and it's very important to understand that the perspective we bring in this data is from observing the dedicated leak sites, which certain threat actors maintain as a way of exerting additional pressure on their victims. That's where the term double extortion comes from. So not only have they stolen and encrypted the data, making it unavailable to the victim, they are now also threatening to leak that data and shame the victim, shame its employees and its clients. And that acts as an extra lever for extortion. Now, if the victim agrees to a ransom independently with the actor and pays that ransom, it may well be that we don't see that victim. And that's where Diana's dark number comes from. We now get a sense of that because law enforcement has successfully penetrated some of these networks and can reveal what the actual number of victims was. And so we can infer that the actual number of victims is about 50% higher than what we see visibly, which would then, Andrew, give you the sense of how many are paying and how many aren't paying. So it would seem to me that about a third are paying, and the other.
I think this is a shortcut, Charles. I think this is a slight shortcut
mathematically,
because, like Diana mentioned, like a victim for law enforcement is anyone that has been breached by the threat actor. Some of those victims might have opened a malicious email and nothing came out of it. But they are
I think
victims.
it's based on the decryption keys, the number of decryption keys that they can see on the platform.
Yeah, again, I think there's a lot of different perspectives. Okay. Yeah. So this is based on decryption keys. So we know that these victims have been compromised and their data has been encrypted, but they didn't appear on the leak site. So that gives us that sort of 40, 60, 30, 70 split roughly. But of course, what you're saying is also true. There's many other companies that have been hacked that aren't anywhere in this cycle, and we don't see that. We don't see how many attacks have been rebuffed. Johan, we've answered your question. There were several questions from Emily Dion. I don't know if you had an opportunity to look
We're
at
working
them
through the
about
questions.
victimization. Are you busy answering it in the text? There's a question from Ronald Dolfsma, which I think maybe Robinson, you could have a stab at, and Simon, I'd be interested to hear your views.
Is it
security measures? What are the security
measures? Yeah.
Do we have an opinion on that?
So, I mean, it kind of comes back to threat actor profile. Like, what is the root cause of being breached on average by a cyber extortion threat actor? And what we know is that on average, cyber extortion threat actors are very opportunistic. Like they are either pummeling one like attack that they are very comfortable about, and that can be malicious attachment, that can be brute force, that can be social engineering, or they are jumping from published vulnerability to published vulnerability, opportunistically looking for vulnerabilities that are very easy to scan for. For instance, there was, I think 2 years ago, an Exchange vulnerability that was a remote code exec, but you needed to be logged in to the OWA. This vulnerability was almost exploited nowhere. And weirdly, because like they certainly have credentials somewhere, but putting the two together was slightly above
too much work.
What it needs to be a good vulnerability.
Right.
So now to translate that into security control, well, it's all the basics. It's good patch management. It's good endpoint security, email security, and employee awareness in general. What we have seen that has risen in the last 2 years is the valid credential root cause. As in, we don't know how they got those credentials. We might have eliminated a lot of places where those credentials could have been compromised, and we see they were not compromised there, yet they came in, right password, got it. And this poses a lot of questions, and I think, Simone, you have some ideas about that? Like about
Yes.
those identity protections?
Yeah, great summary. Thank you. And multi-factor authentication, I think, is one of the most important. And we see with the, like you mentioned, with the credential access, you see some ransomware groups like Akira and other groups. They do brute forcing in a combination of vulnerability usage and the with password spraying. They try to get into it, or they buy at the dark web the credentials. So there are four main what I see when I do attack flows and when I analyze ransomware groups, four main initial access ways. They've got the vulnerabilities that they use, and what we also see very interesting. I've got now a case where a 0 day was used. The moment they have 0 days from APT and they see that APTs are using, for example, Ivanti, then they also try to use Ivanti. So they not only take the vulnerabilities that are now common. So we have statistics that we can see from 2017 until 2023 which vulnerabilities ransomware groups are using. So this is something you can take for threat hunting and recommendation. You systematically check that, and then you see the 0 day and the latest vulnerabilities that they use, initial access that they try to brute force with password spraying, that they take the spear phishing. Spear phishing is something what we see with re-victimization. So after 3 or 4 years, they take old correspondence, email correspondence, and then they write with spear phishing this trust aspect. Psychology is very important. So what you mentioned, Robinson, awareness, they always try with the social engineering to come into your system, means also with spear phishing that you trust those guys who are writing you, and then there's a link or attachment, you open it because you trust this person, and then it happened. So these are the main initial accesses, and then, like he mentioned, the recommendation is to have multi-factor authentication, to check the vulnerabilities first, to block the IOCs, the tooling that they use, to understand the security controls. So I've got an EDR, and the EDR says, okay, 100% should be detected, but it depends on the security controls I've implemented. So to check the policies as a part of the threat informed defense would be a real behavior testing in your own environment to check constantly, are there any gaps, and then to take the gaps to proactively hunt and prevent. So proaction. Don't wait until something happens, reactive, be proactive and try to mitigate.
Simon, while I've got you on the line, I want to ask you another question from Johan Marnovic, who I don't know if he's still on. And Diana, I think you might have an opinion on this also. He's asking about spillover of state-backed threat activity into the private sector. Are we seeing that, and is that a contributing factor here?
Maybe Diana, you would like to start?
If we see a spillover by what into the private sector? What did you say?
State-backed actors.
State-backed.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, we can't know for sure, you know. So that's the first answer. The second is
and
that,
to be
of
fair,
course,
in some cases the frontier was very thin to begin with. Like some state-backed actors are definitely moonlighting in the private sector, and we know about that. We've known about that for a while.
Yes, and you see it in the threat intelligence, for example, Chinese ransomware and threat actors, and Iranian, for example, Darkbit. Such threat actors are nation state backed, like Muddy Water with Darkbit, for example. We see that, but I don't know if we've got concrete data about that in our environment. Maybe you can say something about that.
We have qualitative data basically on the narrative of threat actors, right? Until 2022, they've been heavily trying to convince us that they are financially motivated and financially motivated only, because they didn't want to, catch the attention of governments and the public sector to be disrupted. But then the Ukraine war, or the war against Ukraine, began, and we actually saw that some of the threat actor groups could become political just overnight and actually do support nation states. So that has absolutely changed, and is a possibility that we kind of considered before but could never really prove. So yeah, I think it's a possibility, absolutely.
Yes,
And
like
we also
Revel,
know
for
that civil
example.
servants are very badly paid everywhere.
What did you say? What?
Civil servants are very badly paid everywhere.
There's another question, technical question again, maybe for you, Simon and Robinson. Donald is sort of drawing the conclusion, I don't think he's entirely wrong, that it feels like anyone and everyone can eventually be a victim. So that being the case, doesn't it make more sense to invest in disaster recovery, business continuity, etc.?
Wants to start?
Is it like the
Absolutely.
three little piggies strategy?
What's the three little piggies strategy?
Like you build your house out of straw so that you can rebuild it very quickly when the wolf comes back.
Yeah.
I would say though, yes, definitely. If you feel like your house is made of straw, maybe focus on being able to rebuild it solidly the first time it falls down, but then don't repeat it. Like once you rebuild it properly.
Exactly, yes.
Simone?
And I think
Yeah,
it's
you
very
can feel the same.
important to have a business continuity management plan with a disaster recovery, maybe also the crisis management, and to do tabletops, purple teaming, crisis management exercises to be really prepared and to, like he said, be fast back and hopefully not a second time the victim, because you did it properly.
I think I take your point, Robinson, and of course, that is the answer you have to give, is both. But I do also think that what the shift from ransomware to double extortion, and then the shift from extortion to re-victimization shows is that the experience of the victim can change a lot. And I think it's important to bear that in mind, that what you're fundamentally trying to present for this form of crime is to be a victim of extortion, not just to be a victim of a compromise. And I think that in some ways that can only be done if you're thinking in that space, right? If you're thinking, well, how do I get out of this end state? It's the end state that I want to get out of. Rather than the beginning state. Now, obviously, you don't want threat actors crawling all over your network, but what Diana's demonstrated is they don't even have to be crawling all over your network, right? They just have to have access to your previously compromised information. And that does suggest, I think, that we need to adopt a broader definition of resilience that is more mindful of the true nature of the crime. I said true nature of the crime, Diana. Now I also sound like a criminologist. All right. I'm going to see if maybe we can take one more question. Greg says he thinks the position of civil servants in France will improve in the next few months. So there's a bullet dodged over there. Apart from that, I think we have now addressed all of the questions. So I think that's a good time to leave it. There are still a few people on the call with us. Thank you very much if you stuck with us this long. We always appreciate talking to you. Always appreciate your support. We know that there are many airlines you can fly with, so thank you for choosing us this afternoon. And to my panelists, Robinson, Simone, Diana, I always love these conversations with you. Thanks for your time and your energy and your passion. And to Medina, who never wants to be named, in the back office, sweating away. Thank you for all your effort. We appreciate it. And with that, have a great week and read our report.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
Read the
Charles.
report. It's
Thank
really
you
good.
to our audience. Thank you. Bye.
Right.